Welcome to Crawlspace. I'm Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
I'm doing great today, Tim. We have one of our guests on today who has been on recently, very recently, and the subject matter that we covered was very serious the first time around. This content is not as serious. It has some serious elements, some danger, but it gave us the chance to explore our relationship with this person on a little bit more of a jovial level. And what she's done in her professional career is remarkable. But before we get to that, Tim, I want to write the chapter on how you're doing today. How are you? Is this a long chapter, or is it sort of like one of those short Stephen King chapters that says, I'm good?
Yeah, it's a prologue type of chapter. I'm doing great. I'm well. I'm excited to speak with author Kerrie Droban again. Yes, we spoke with her only like a month ago about the book that she co-wrote called Aurora, the psychiatrist who treated the movie theater killer, tells her story. And this appearance from Kerrie, we are talking about her other books. Most of them have to do with motorcycle gangs. And yeah, that is a little more jovial, a little lighter than the movie theater mass shooter for sure. But definitely some good danger, some good stories of danger involved. One of her books, Vagos, Mongols, and Outlaws, My Infiltration of America's Deadliest Biker Gangs, that she co-wrote with Charles Falco, is great. Really interesting stories. So we highly recommend her books on motorcycle gangs.
Specifically, OMGs, the Outlaw Motorcycle Gangs. So they were OMGs before OMG was a thing in the lexicon of the younger generation. And that really took me back to the days of my motorcycle gang, the LOLs.
Well, that sounds like a dangerous group there, Lance. Luckily, Kerrie hasn't written the book about about the LOLs quite yet. But these books are fantastic, and she has got so many stories. And her story of how she got involved in writing these books about biker gangs is really fascinating as well.
Yeah, and be sure to check out, if you haven't listened to the episode that we had her on where she talks about her experience with Dr. Lynn Fenton about the Aurora movie theater shooting. Check that out.
And Lance, Crawlspace Premium is up and running, and you can get every single episode of Crawlspace ad-free at crawlspace.supportingcast.fm.
Because you can't just say Operation Black Biscuit and not have an extensive follow-up.
You're right. I hope you enjoy this, and I hope you check out Kerrie's books. They are fantastic. And you can find everything that Kerrie does at kerriedroban.com.
And Tim, I know that there are some ads in this particular episode on the public feed, and Kerrie had sent me a message after recording her interview with us that the motorcycle gangs will oftentimes listen to podcasts while they're cruising around on their Harleys, and they get really upset when they hear ads. Is there a place where she can direct the Mongols to go to in order to get ad-free episodes?
Yeah, there is. All Mongols, Vagos, Outlaws, and other Crawlspace listeners can go to crawlspace.supportingcast.fm and subscribe to Crawlspace Premium there. And just for $4.99 per month, you'll get every single episode ad-free. You'll also get our weekly bonus show, which is just a blast. It's a little bit of a peek behind the curtains here at Crawlspace Media, but we also dive in deeper to the cases that we cover and some of the interviews we do as well.
That's awesome. And where can we direct the Hells Angels to go if they wanted to follow us on social media?
Well, if they want to follow us, they can do so at Crawlspace Podcast or Crawlspace Pod on social media. Thanks a lot for listening, everybody. We're going to break quick for commercial here, and we'll be right back with Kerrie Droban.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program. Welcome back to the podcast, author Kerrie Droban. How are you today?
I'm great. I'm great. Thanks for having me back.
Well, there's a handful of guests that come on our show, and within the first 5 minutes, they'll say something, and we'll make a note of it because we need to get back in touch with them so they can come back on to talk about the thing that they touched upon in the beginning, which wasn't the actual topic of what we were discussing previously. And you had said within the first, I think, 4 minutes of our interview that we did about James Holmes and Dr. Lynn Fenton, your book Aurora, you had said, I was approached by some secret operatives for Operation Black Biscuit. And I think both Tim and I immediately circled that in our notes that we needed to come back to that. So welcome back to the show. And we're very excited to talk about Operation Black Biscuit, which to me, I just harken back to like burnt Thanksgiving dinners.
No, it's actually it was an innocuous term used to describe a hockey puck. A black biscuit is a hockey puck.
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
Nothing at all to do with the investigation, but that was a way to sort of keep it undercover and under wraps. But yeah, that was my first book was Running with the Devil, and that was a infiltration, ATF's infiltration of the Hells Angels. So that was my introduction into true crime and into a world that I had no idea what I was getting into at the time, but yes, an undercover operative approached me and asked me if I would be interested in writing about the investigation. And my initial response, because I've never written true crime before, and I was a defense attorney, I still am a defense attorney, but at the time I thought, no, not going to get into writing about the Hells Angels. I know nothing about them, and I know nothing about, undercover operations. And so by the third time he asked me to do this, I finally said yes. And that really changed the course of my life, writing that book. And it led to a series of other books on outlaw motorcycle gangs, and it kind of launched my career into that whole true crime realm. So it was a pretty fascinating and scary experience.
Yeah, please take us through this. So an undercover agent from the ATF approached you?
Yes, he approached me, and the investigation was ongoing. So it was even more dicey to be involved in that, because as a lawyer, I knew that if they told me their story and somebody in the ATF found out about it, they could actually be charged with a crime. So my role in this was to keep their story undercover. So I was writing undercover while they were undercover. And the PS to this whole caper is that my ex-husband at the time was actually also undercover working with the ATF in that task force, unbeknownst to me. So neither one of us knew what the other was doing, which made it even more interesting and crazy. But so it basically took a year of my life writing about this and doing a lot of interviews that sort of were reminiscent of Deep Throat, meeting the operatives in hotel rooms and garages and places where I was interviewing them and not able to record things and not able to really take notes because there couldn't be a paper trail. And so at the time, I even had to get an agent without a paper trail. And so, everybody took a big chance on me because it was, it was sort of a first time. This was sort of the beginning of writing about undercover operations. There was really only one other book out at the time about an infiltration into the Mongols. And so this was a brand new frontier, and a lot of publishers, people were interested in this. And so this was, it was really sort of trial by error, learning how to do this and getting the information. And then about 6 months into the writing of this book, the operatives went south. So I was sort of left holding the bag and having to write this story without any guideposts. I mean, people just sort of ran scared and left me to finish writing this. And the other kind of scary piece to this was a huge landmark case. This was the first ever time where there had been indictments of major players, and I did not want to be the person that was going to jeopardize these pending prosecutions. And so, I had a conversation with my publisher at the time, and I said, can we delay the publication of this book? I mean, I saw my law career and my writing career ending very quickly with this book. And I thought, I'm going to get subpoenaed. I'm going to have to testify. And so, I had to get a vault to keep a lot of this confidential information in. And it was actually a really stressful, terrifying experience to do this. But it all eventually worked out. It was just it was a wild ride.
No pun intended.
No pun intended. Yes. Yeah, I had to learn a lot about motorcycles, a lot about the gang, a lot about, undercover work. It was just a crash course in all of it.
Okay, cool. That was actually my next question, which is, we all hear about the Hells Angels. We hear about some of the other motorcycle gangs. I think we all mostly hear about Hells Angels just because they, I think, are in the media more. But you had mentioned the Mongols. There's several other very dangerous motorcycle gangs. Can you fill us in a little bit on maybe their history and how they differ from, say, like the mafia? What kind of crimes were you trying to get them on?
So outlaw motorcycle, they call them OMGs. So outlaw motorcycle gangs are really America's largest export. That's how I look at them. I've written about the big five. That would be the Pagans, the Outlaws, the Vagos, the Hells Angels, Mongols. And they all have a lot of similarities and just a few nuances between them that distinguish them. But the way that they, are characterized and I guess are different from the mafia. I mean, I've actually, I think people would view them as the mafia on wheels. But so they're organized criminals. It's an organized criminal fraternity, if you will. But it borrows a lot of their structure from the military. In fact, a lot of the members are either former or active military, which is kind of a startling fact if you really, dig deep into that. But they borrow that rank and file structure. So they have, it's organized criminal fraternity. So they have a president, a vice president, sergeant at arms, who's like an enforcer, a treasurer, and a secretary, and they also have a road captain. And so the requirement for membership is you have to have a heart to be a male. So those are like the very limited requirements, but they have, bylaws, they have a constitution, they hold regular meetings, which they call church meetings, but they are the 1%ers. And the way they got that term is it originated way back when there was a big brawl in Hollister, California, between some originating gangs, and the police got involved, and the American Motorcycle Association said, 99% of motorcyclists are law abiding, but then there's this 1% that are not. And so of course the OMGs latched on to that, and they call themselves the 1%ers. So they are really the 1% of motorcyclists that commit 99% of the crime. So they have, a national presence and an international presence. And the reason that they have that is, as I mentioned, they're America's largest export, is they are forming a network of criminal connections and intelligence, because their whole purpose is to grow their criminal organization. And they are involved in drug trafficking, arms trafficking, murder. But those are some of the main things. And the government is constantly trying to infiltrate these gangs to get intelligence on them and to cripple them, because it's the main source of drug trafficking in the United States and worldwide. And so it's definitely a threat to public safety. So that's the reason that they're trying to get involved in that. And the way that they are similar, I mean, there are several of them that have formed symbiotic relationships with the mafia. And so they have a lot of similarities with them because they're an organized criminal syndicate. And, they take care of their own. They And by that, I mean, they can eliminate, problem children within their own organization, but their whole purpose is to acquire territory because there can only be one bully in the sandbox, so that's what's causing a lot of the rivalry between these outlaw gangs. A long answer to your question, but
Oh, it's perfect. It's perfect. And when you were approached to do this, was your first instinct, this isn't something that I have ever considered, and I don't know if I'm going to be like good at it?
I had a lot of concerns when I was first approached to do this. I mean, I started out originally as a prosecutor, and when I was a prosecutor, I did a lot of gang prosecution. But the gang prosecution that I did were the street gangs, and the street gangs are vastly different from these organized criminals, organized gangs. So I really didn't know that I had the qualifications to do that, but I did know that I was a really good researcher and a good interviewer. And so that's really where the bulk of the information came from, because it's not like you have a lot of literature out there to go and read and corroborate. I mean, this is all literally going into the trenches and doing the interviews like a journalist, but also being really mindful of the fact that you're writing about these sensitive investigations that are ongoing, many of them, that the people that I was writing about, I had to worry about protecting their identities because, there was so much repercussion for not only informants. I mean, snitches, in fact, most of the outlaw clubs have a slogan, snitches are a dying breed, so if they find out there's a snitch or an informant, I mean, that's a death knell for them. So there's a tremendous amount of pressure and responsibility on me to make sure that not only did I get the story right, because accuracy was really important, not only for future lawsuits, but to keep all of these various players at bay. I didn't want to be under the wrath, incurring the wrath of the Hells Angels or incurring the wrath of these operatives, or endangering them. So it was a very tricky balancing act, and it sort of continued. So Running with the Devil became the launching pad for all of these other books. So my second book that I wrote was about the Pagans, and they're a motorcycle gang based out in Philadelphia. And that was, somebody had read Running with the Devil and approached me and said, I'd like you to write my story. And so he was somebody from inside the organization. So each one of the books takes a different perspective on these different biker gangs, which is actually fascinating from, a writer's standpoint. So I was writing about not only a fascinating subculture, but also these very dicey undercover investigations that required really sensitive care, to be able to not really exploit that or endanger them. And, so the way that manifested in Running with the Devil was being very careful with the photographs, not to expose their identities or their faces, because at the time that the book was published, nobody was known, they were still undercover. So it was really an interesting experience with that.
Wow. So I just want to stay with when you were approached for a moment there. What's the benefit of this of documenting this story while there's a current investigation going?
Well, I think that there's tremendous benefit. I mean, and that's one of the reasons I write true crime, I think, is to be, I want to be able to communicate something and be informative about something that people really don't know a lot about. And so I felt that outlaw motorcycle gangs were kind of an unknown entity under very few undercover investigations that were yielding a lot of information, especially for the public. There was a public misperception, which has been perpetuated a lot by these gangs, where they want the public to see them as, sort of these innocuous bikers just, doing fundraising and charitable work. And, I mean, it's crazy sort of disconnect there. But that's all to perpetuate this public image that they're really not as bad as people think they are, when really underneath they are. They're, one gang, for example, the Vagos, has been dubbed urban terrorists, by law enforcement. I mean, so there's this perception that I wanted to dispel, which is these are people engaged in very dangerous acts, and I wanted to showcase the bravery of these informants and undercover operatives that were risking everything to go in and gather this intelligence so that the public could be more informed, so that we could, cripple this or stop this, or at least understand what was going on literally right under our noses. And so I think really the propellant for me, which is, get in there, write something really important and something that is not very well known, and not only for its titillation, but also the fact that I want to educate people on what's really going on and what they need to be aware of. And the interesting thing for me is that during the writing process, I mean, there were a couple of books, The Last Chicago Boss, the people I was writing about became my friend, so it was an interesting perspective for me to see that, like, how do, what is the allure and attraction for some of these bikers to get involved in these biker gangs, and why is it important to write about it, and why did they want to write their story? So a lot of that sort of segued into my reason for writing it too.
Interesting. Yeah. Thank you. And for the undercover operative who approached you, did they expect to get murdered or something? Like, did they expect this story to never come out if it wasn't documented in this way?
I think that was really a part of it. I think that they so Running with the Devil was a really extraordinary case for so many reasons. It was a case in improvisation. The ATF operatives that started this had no idea what they were doing. It wasn't scripted. It was, they didn't know if they were going to even get inside the Hells Angels. They didn't know if they were going to be made members, so that's another term that's sort of borrowed from the mafia. And so it was really sort of, they were risking to try to get inside, to get into the Hells Angels, which nobody really had known about other than Hunter Thompson's, exploits in there. So I think that for them, it was really important to have that story told, because, I mean, and I don't know that they thought they were going to be murdered, although the main operative in this case went on to have a contract on his life for a couple of years. So he went on the run. He was relocating different cities every, 2 months. He had his house arsoned. So he had terrible things happen to him as a result of this undercover investigation. But he, probably weighed the pros and cons of it and decided that, and actually he was pretty smart about it, but he decided that if he became a public figure, if he told his story, it was further protection for him, also was going to reveal what he actually did. And so I think for a lot of these undercover operatives, nobody knows what they do. They don't get credit for anything. They live, under the radar. They're never, on work if there aren't indictments reached. And many of these cases, unfortunately, don't stick. In fact, in Running with the Devil, one of the tragedies of that is that all of the indictments got dismissed. They couldn't make the charges stick. So here they had sacrificed 18 months of their life, put everything on the line, and they really didn't get any results out of it. So I think it was twofold, so let's tell this story and let's see, what we can get out of it, and in the Vagos, Mongols, and Outlaws, which is Charles Falco's story, he infiltrated 3 outlaw biker gangs. I mean, he is an extraordinary government informant, and went on to really become pretty famous as a result of that. But, he too didn't know what he was going to get out of it. But again, if you don't tell that story, nobody knows. I mean, it's sort of like the Donnie Brasco story. What did we learn about the mafia? We would never have known had Donnie Brasco not gone undercover into the mafia. So I think there's a little bit of that too. Like, let's tell the story. Let's get something out of this, so that maybe other people can benefit from it.
How did you go about gaining the trust of some of these individuals? Because you said that you had made some friends in there and it felt like you might be on some level betraying them. What was your steps in gaining their trust in the first place?
Well, it was kind of interesting. I think one of the keys to this, and I think this is something that has served me well, even as a defense lawyer, is to have no judgment. to just be the person that is receiving the information and to tell the story in the way that they want it to be told. My one rule with all of them was that I needed it to be accurate. I didn't want to tell something that was, fabrication, that was something where I was, going to be challenged on something, because I didn't have a lot of corroborating backup material. I mean, some of these were not in infiltrations, some of them were just their stories, like the pagan who were to tell his story. I mean, it's a horrific story. He raised in this organized crime family and solicited by his nemesis to murder his father. I mean, that's a pretty crazy story, but it was extraordinary in the sense that, I mean, it took 2 years to write that story. And he never, before, I guess he had never told anybody about this before. So I was the first person that he talked to. And it took 2 years really to get him to open up. And, and eventually I had to, I felt like I really needed to meet him in person. And so I flew him out to my turf so that I could have a conversation with him and know him and really kind of understand what he was experiencing, because it definitely wasn't my world. It was very, very foreign to me. But by doing that, I think it really solidified that connection that I needed for the story, and also to get him to trust me in the story. And so, and that was sort of the motto that I followed all of the books. It took a couple of years to write one of these, in large part because I'm building rapport. I'm building rapport and I'm getting their story. And it's not easy to go up to someone and say, tell me the most, the 5 most important things that happened to you. I mean, it's really hard. Like, I couldn't do it. So I think that just by talking to them, sometimes they would give me a nugget where I would then circle back and say, okay, that's the story. What you're telling me is not the story, but that might be the story. So a lot of it had to do with the interview and just building that rapport and really learning about what it was like to be in that culture.
And how does one get into that culture? Like, I guess, how do the ATF agents do it as well? Like, how do they, get inside?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so they have to, in the Run-In with the Devil case, they had to get inside. They did something crazy, but they decided to impersonate a real biker gang based out of Tijuana, Mexico. So they became the Solo Angels, but the Solo Angels did not have a chapter in Arizona. So they felt like they could take on this persona. So they had, fake identities. They had a backstory that they invented. So it was very much like an improvisational theater, but they had to prospect for the Hells Angels, prospect to get inside the Hells Angels. And prospecting is this period of time where you call it kind of training day, where they become, they either get sponsored by somebody in the club or they prospect. And prospecting means you become the slave of whomever is going to sponsor you. So you are in that lifestyle 24/7. So imagine the operative has to be undercover 24/7, has to be a slave to, this group, this chapter that he's trying to infiltrate. And that means that, if he's ordered to go get, Taco Bell at, 1 o'clock in the morning in another city, he's got to go do it. And if he brings that taco back in, the sponsor says, now I want it with salsa, with salsa, without salsa, so they're doing all of these crazy, tests. It's sort of like fraternity hazing. They've got to pass a certain number of tests. And so one is, the Hells Angels want to make sure that the infiltrator is not a cop, so they subject them to drug tests. They subject them to women. And that was one of the really interesting things about Running with the Devil, was that was a period of time where the operative, he was married, he had children. So he had his, day life where he had to somehow accommodate his family, but also be this undercover outlaw biker 24/7. And so the one test that he could not pass was to have random women thrown at him. So they had to come up with a way to overcome that test. And the way they did that was they recruited a female agent, a female undercover agent. And that was interesting in and of itself, because they had to find somebody that was going to blend in, that wasn't going to look like a cop, that was going to be comfortable in this environment, this very misogynistic world, right? Bikers hate women. They treat them as, second class citizens, sometimes subhuman, right? So you had to find somebody willing to do that. And they did find somebody. And in fact, she was an extraordinary agent. And she developed a rapport with the women in this group. And so the women have their own hierarchy, right? But the goal of the women is to become the property of. So if they become the old lady of one of these members, they are then at the command or the beck and will of this person. But as property, they're also protected. So it was a very interesting dynamic, because the female agent was gathering intelligence on that side, because a lot of the women in the biker culture are the ones that do the dirty work. They're the ones that do the petty crimes. They, some of them are working as dispatchers in, law enforcement. So they're gathering intelligence. And so this female operative was really, instrumental, I think, in getting them into, the inner sanctum of the Hells Angels. So each one of the books takes a different angle, but that to me was the most fascinating, because now they had like this, double the intelligence that they could get on their own.
This is incredible to me. So this guy was presented with women as a test. Like, he had to sleep with these women that the members presented him with, and because he was married, he couldn't do that. So he had to come up with something on the spot to say, no, I already have, I guess they call him an old lady. I already have one. And then where does he go from there? Does he like leave and make a phone call and say, listen, you guys have to find me somebody to come in to be my old lady?
Much. Yes. And the interesting thing
why
about
would someone do this to themselves? Like this, it stresses me out listening to this. Is it worth it?
Yeah, it's crazy amount of stress, right? I mean, you can imagine, it's crazy. This woman.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor.
And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
This agent, Jenna, gets into this investigation, and she is a new recruit. She has never done undercover work before. So this is like even more extraordinary. Even more extraordinary. So she's this beautiful, voluptuous agent, right, who happens to fit the bill perfectly. And she has this gift of gab, and she's extraordinary with the Hells Angels. So they love her, so, but I mean, it took an extraordinary woman to be able to do this, because they went through a couple of others who looked too much like cops, and the operative was afraid that the women were actually going to blow his cover. So it was a really dicey, scary situation for them to figure this out. But that's how they were able to do it. And that's how they were able to keep the investigation going for 18 months. But it created a whole nother host of problems, because now they needed surveillance and security on the women, because, they don't mix, right? The women are not made members. And so the women have their own hierarchy, their own division. And so while this female agent's gathering intelligence from the women, the men are doing other things. And so in order to keep this female agent safe, they had to have two sets of surveillance, two sets of things. So it became a really like a monumental, dangerous task. So that's another reason this investigation was so interesting and so dangerous and unique, because it's the first time they ever brought a woman in.
Yeah, that's wild. And what would happen if they were found out as agents?
Well, I think if they were out and they weren't able to get out, I mean, they could be executed. I mean, that's really what the end game is. I mean, as soon as they find out they're informants or they find out they're cops, I mean, now there's a hit on them. And so, I mean, and that's what they do to informants. They shoot them on the spot. So there were a couple of close calls in Running with the Devil where that happened. There were a couple of close calls with Charles Falco in Vagos, Mongols, and Outlaws, because it's really, really difficult to be in that role 24/7 and also maintain some semblance of another life, which is really an interesting dynamic, and a lot of these outlaws had had a similar issue. They had, it's expensive to be an outlaw. People can say it's expensive. You have to maintain your Harley. You have to pledge your allegiance to the club 24/7. It's very difficult to have a day job while you're doing that, right? But you still have to maintain your mortgage and your other things, because a lot of these guys had families and children, and that's the rub of it. So, while many of them just engage the women to be their front line and put them in prostitution and other things, there were some that actually had a double life. So it's kind of an ironic thing. The outlaws had a double life, and the undercover operatives had a double life. So you have outlaws, some of them were stockbrokers, accountants, lawyers, doctors. They were in veterinary clinics. It's really interesting. They just sort of are among us. So we don't actually know sometimes that they're working there, but they have to make a living.
So there's like an accountant or a veterinarian who gets up in the morning and kisses his wife and kids goodbye, and then he goes to work and maybe bangs out of work early so that he can go embark on like a crime spree for a few hours.
They're obligated. There are mandatory activities that they must participate in if they are going to be a member of a club. For example, runs. Okay, runs. I like to say, so Muslims will go to the wall, bikers will go to Sturgis. There are mandatory runs. Anytime there's a funeral, if a biker dies and you're within 500 miles of that funeral, you must attend. And sometimes there are funerals that 2 or 3 funerals a day where these bikers must attend. So that's one mandatory thing, no matter what you're doing. So if you're in the middle of your day job and there's a death, you must attend. So it's very difficult to juggle the two. In fact, in the last Chicago Boss, which was profiled the boss of Chicago, of the Chicago Outlaws, Big Pete, there's a really funny chapter in there where he talks about some of the members of his chapter are asking for a day off. They're asking for a timeout so they can go and do their day job. I think one of them says, "Can we take a break for just a week? I need to take a week off." And Big Pete's response to that was absolute outrage. It's like, you don't take a break when you're a biker. This is your job. Like, this is your lifestyle. You're pledging to it. So no, we're not going to take a break. Like, one of them wanted to take a break to take his wife out to a Valentine's Day dinner. And Big Pete's like, "Can't do that. We're outlaws." So there's some very like comical repercussions from some of this, but that really the rub of it is if you want to be this, you can't also be that, but you also have to make money. So of course, that's where the criminal element comes in. They're making money through drug trafficking, arms trafficking, and other exploits.
Is each like chapter sort of independent financially, or do they have to give anything to a higher entity?
So they pay their club dues. So each chapter has their own club dues, and they acquire different support groups. So the support groups are also bikers, outlaw bikers that pledge their allegiance to the bigger group. And so the job or the role of the support group is to help the bigger group grow, right? You're always growing the business. So you're not going to infringe on territory, but you're going to fund this stuff. So you're invited to the parties, ostensibly because you're going to contribute money to the parties. You're funding it. There's also a defense fund, which each chapter has, but then you're paying into the larger international chapters, so everybody's paying their dues to go in towards something else. So that's where it's expensive, so if you don't pay your dues, then there's the debt collection part of it. It's very much, it's like the mafia that way in a sense, as you go and you're paying the tax man.
Did you ever ask any of them why this was an appealing lifestyle?
Oh, sure. Yeah. They'll all say that this was what they were born to do. It's sort of like being born into blood. This was in their sights. All they ever wanted to be. Like, for example, the boss of Chicago, all he ever wanted to be from a child was the boss of Chicago, and however he was going to get there. So the Outlaw Motorcycle Club was his vehicle to get there. Many of them are, as I said, either former or active military, and they come into this is a brotherhood. So it's a place where they can finally belong. They have their roles to play. There's no confusion about what they are or who they are. And it's this real sort of collegiate experience, if you will, even though it's a criminal fraternity. It's something that keeps them together. I mean, brothers will protect brothers. I mean, their motto is club first. Their club is their family. Club first, then God, then country, then dogs, then women. Kind of goes in that order.
That's an actual thing?
Yes. That's an actual thing. And it's really across the board. I mean, those are the commonalities. The ideology of the Outlaw Motorcycle gang, the OMG, is it's about power and respect. And so, there's a long recruiting process, a training ground, if you will, to get into the club and to become a made patched member. And so when you wear, the whole goal is to acquire these patches, and the patches have the insignia of the club that they're trying to join. So, for example, the Vagos has the Loki insignia, and the Loki is like the god of mischief on, and the colors, green and red, is an homage to the Mexican flag, for example. So everything has its place. There's an order to all of it. The Bandidos, for example, are red and gold colors, and that's an homage to the Marine Corps. So a lot of them missed that camaraderie and that brotherhood that they experienced in the military, and they find it again in the outlaw motorcycle world, because the idea is that brothers will stick up for brothers. When one goes, all go. I mean, it's that sort of motto. They are a collective. And so it's that security, maybe that sense of belonging and identity, that really is an alluring thing for any gang, I think. I mean, that's where they find their family. But for outlaw motorcycle gangs, I mean, not only do you go through the prospecting period to become a made member, but then you're given all of the paraphernalia that identifies you with that particular club. So you get the tattoos and the patches and and then it's a lifestyle, and then you're in it 24/7, and then you don't have to think about something else that you need to do, because this is your job.
Sounds a lot like podcasting. with the jackets and the tattoos and the
That's true. Did you say dogs over women in that hierarchy?
Yes, women are the subhuman category. They're the ones that do all of the dirty work. I mean, there have been even cases where women has orchestrated a hit. A club would do the hit, but she's like lured the person there. They do the prostitution. It's really kind of mind-boggling to me that women would be attracted to this sort of thing. But but in talking to some of them, I mean, the reason that they like it is there's no confusion about their roles. And some of them find it a challenge to get this misogynistic group of people to actually respect them. So they've got like a role, and if they're a property of somebody, they feel a certain amount of protection, because if something happens to them, it happens to the person that they are the property of. It's a really strange kind of club, but that's what they're attracted to. And then you've got sort of these this allure from, you've got the professional women who are attracted to the outlaw bad boy image. And so they will hang out at some of the clubhouses, they'll engage in some of the parties, because they get to role play and be somebody else for a while. No idea why that's attractive, but that's what they tell me.
Are the dogs in any way more protected than the women if they have ownership, I guess?
I don't know. I haven't actually explored that too much, but I mean, I know that they are. Well, I mean, I know one in particular who had a bulldog who, I mean, adored the bulldog. The bulldog was given a special status in the club. So yeah, I mean, I think they do revere them. I mean, they revere them more than they do women.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
Was there ever a time when you were meeting with these individuals and getting their stories that you felt like you might have some sort of, might be put in some sort of danger?
I never really felt any danger because I felt like I was the conduit for their story. I think it's really interesting that, as a woman, and given the cultural attitude about women, that I was somebody that they trusted so much. I mean, and I'm talking about the members of these groups, not the operatives and the people that were telling me their stories in those books. But it was kind of an interesting perspective, to be able to see the other side of it and to be able to interview the women in the groups, in the clubs, and find out from their perspective. And again, I think the reason that it worked is because I didn't have any judgment. I was really just sort of listening to their story and trying to understand from their point of view why this would be attractive. And yet at the same time, writing about these incredibly brutal acts toward women, toward many people, but definitely toward women. And so that was a really interesting perspective.
Yeah, for sure. And this next question, you might not have an answer to because it is sort of a obscure question that I've just always been curious about in terms of motorcycle gangs. Do they all have to have Harley-Davidsons? And is the company Harley-Davidson somehow affiliated with or have some, I guess, read between the lines type agreement with these motorcycle gangs? Or have they tried to disassociate themselves from the gangs?
I'm not aware of any conscious effort to disassociate themselves. And I'm not aware of any actual agreement that they're going. I mean, they're not endorsing it, but the Harley-Davidson is, it's really, it goes back to a long line of military. I mean, the military, I guess, personnel, if you will, had Harleys. And so that was really where it originated from. But yes, to answer your question, the requirement is you have to have a Harley. You can't have another kind of bike. It has to be a Harley, but not every one of them can afford a Harley. So, sometimes the attraction to the sponsor is the fact that the prospect has a Harley, so it's a status symbol, but it's an expensive bike, so it's an interesting paradox, I guess, if you will, because a lot of them can't afford it, but it's a requirement. And so they have to somehow fund that lifestyle and fund that way of getting a bike, because you can't go on a run without a bike, and so it's a requirement. So I'm not aware of any agreement that they've reached with Harley-Davidson, although I'm sure Harley-Davidson is, made a ton of money off of them.
Yeah, I was thinking about it because I read somewhere a while ago that the Proud Boys wore those shirts that were a particular brand, and I forgot right now. I can't think of the brand name off the top of my head, but that brand came out and said that they have no affiliation with the Proud Boys. It's just a coincidence, like for whatever reason they chose our brand, and they, in a sense, like publicly condemned them and disassociated themselves from that organization. So I don't know. I mean, Harley-Davidson itself, like as a product, is an incredibly well-made machine, and they are a very powerful company too, and they could really take a stance if they wanted to.
They could. I don't think that they would, because they make a lot of money off of it.
Right.
The other thing is, it's the PR campaign, which is, a lot of these bikers, they're hugely connected. There's it's an international connection. I think it would be, from a business sense, it would be probably detrimental to Harley-Davidson to disassociate themselves, and I think part of the reasoning there is, a lot of these outlaw motorcycle gangs, they insist that they are clubs, not gangs, right? So they're trying to distinguish themselves from the criminal organization that they are by saying that they're actually just legitimate motorcycle enthusiasts. And the one thing that they all have in common is they all love to ride, and they all love to have these Harleys, and they're actually, good guys, with a bad rap. They're getting involved in all these charitable organizations. So that's why their public persona is so important to them. They don't want to be perceived. It's really a strange dichotomy. They don't want to be perceived as these rebellious nonconformists, and yet that's what they are. So it's just a weird thing.
It might help if they don't give themselves names like Hell's Angels and
Right.
Mongols. They're, if you wanted to actually put the public face forward that you are trying to do something better in your community, I don't know, Hell's Angels strike like that chord to me.
Right?
How about Heaven's Angels?
Right.
Or just the Angels.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is they all have monikers within the gang. I mean, there's actually, for example, in the Vagos, one of the famous ones, his name is Sniper. So you have a name like Sniper, or Hammer, or or Lonesome. I mean, all these names that sort of in a strange way. I mean, it gives them a persona, right? But it also removes them. It removes them a little bit from the club themselves. I mean, it's an interesting thing. I mean, even street gangs do that too. But
was there a craziest group that out of the groups that you studied, or gangs?
crazy? You mean more violent or more crazy or just like distinguished?
However you'd like to take it, but I guess more violent is one good way.
I think what actually surprised me more than anything about these was how similar they all were. I think the thing that set them apart was, some had more territory, had acquired more territory than another. And so that's what made them bigger, badder. But I think in all, I mean, there's really a commonality between many of them. I mean, they all have the same rank and file structure. They all borrow from that military persona. They all have colors. They all have cuts. They all have the same lack of respect for women. The ideology is the same. So it's interesting. I mean, there really isn't a lot of distinction between them. And I think that, and then the other thing I found kind of fascinating about it is over the years, there's been this sort of evolution of the OMGs to be more clean cut, more to appear more law abiding, because the reasoning behind that is that if all of their members are incarcerated or constantly getting in trouble with the law, then it's bad for business. They can't expand their network if they're all incarcerated. They have to keep repeating that cycle. So I think that's kind of interesting. I mean, so really they're very much alike. I think that I mean, maybe some are just larger than others, I think, and some have more of an international presence. But I think that was really kind of the most surprising thing about it.
And you've written 4 books?
I've written 5 books on motorcycle gangs. Yeah.
5 books on motorcycle gangs. And how much time have you put into that? How many years was that?
This was probably over a 12-year span.
12-year span. And is this the end? Did you finish your latest book and you said, this is it? This is all I can do on this, and you're moving on, or is there more?
No, I mean, I'm definitely moving into another area, I think. But I think as far as the biker subculture, I never say never, but I think that it has to be a really interesting story for me in order to delve into it. I think that, to write another biker book about the subculture and about, it has to be different enough for me to embark on it, because it really takes a lot out of me, each one of these books, because, you're really steeped in this violent, sort of murky world of really, it's a real criminal element, and it takes a while to kind of pull yourself out of it, and it takes a while to, you got to really deal with the people that are involved in it. So like the undercover operatives I mean, having said that, I think it's a fascinating subculture, and I think it's an important one to learn about, because it does impact, it impacts communities in ways that they might not even be aware of. For example, it's, if you have a biker who gets into a bike wreck, right, and they don't die, and they wind up going to the hospital. I mean, that hospital personnel is exposed to that element, because the biker doesn't just come by himself, he comes with his associates. And, the biker might be wearing his cuts. And so there's a certain, protocol in taking off the cuts or dealing with the cuts. I mean, so these are things that can potentially endanger just the medical staff trying to treat the biker, so there's all of those sort of elements that people don't really think about very often, but it impacts, a lot. So I think knowing about the subculture and knowing how they operate and what their ideology is, I think is really important for, community safety.
Yeah, definitely. What's a cut?
Oh, a cut is it's the jackets that they wear. It's the sleeveless denim or leather jackets that contain their patches, that contain their club's insignia and their logo.
Okay. Okay.
It identifies them.
Yeah, some of that stuff could put civilians in danger as well. That's wild.
Yeah, well, and I think it's dangerous too to have a misperception. I mean, I've heard time and time again, people will come up to me and say, "Oh, they're not that bad." I was in a grocery store and somebody, a biker turned around and said, "Hey, and offered to buy my groceries or offered to whatever." So I mean, there. I think it's a dangerous stance to take, to kind of um, to let your guard down, I guess is the best way to say it, because, I think the more that you know about the subculture, the more that you know about how the operations work, you get a really different perspective on things. I mean, this is a highly organized criminal syndicate, and law enforcement has been after them to cripple them, or, at least destroy some of their cells, but it's never going to go away. And I think it's important to at least be aware of it and know what's going on, behind the surface.
Well, another hour has passed. It's felt like 20 minutes. Your stories are so fascinating and riveting and thought-provoking. I think that we're probably going to have you come back on again to, dig deeper into all of this. I never thought that I'd be this fascinated with the history and the going-ons of the motorcycle gangs.
Thank you. I know. I think it's fascinating too.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's important that those books are out there, that your books have been written and they're out there and people can read them and get the information so they know, hey, just because this person who's clearly, a Hell's Angel bought my groceries doesn't mean that if I were to accidentally back my car up into his bike, it wouldn't break both my arms. I think having this information out there, like you said, people being aware and educated in it is super important.
Yes, I really agree. Well, thank you. I mean, thank you for having me on again. I enjoy talking about this topic. I mean, I think it's something I've devoted obviously many years of my life to. So never knew I would be this fascinated with that. So who knew that first book would launch an entire career path.